So welcome everyone. Um, this is the first in our series of fresh talks where the charge is to bring the sutras of our lineage to get to life through our own personal experience, which I think is a high bar or a good standard. This series has developed out of our bi-monthly talks that we used to offer only to priests and priests in training. But we decided at the end of last year to open it up to the public. So I wanted to start by acknowledging that Zen is known to be outside the scripture. So it's based on our direct experience, which can make talking about a sutra kind of tricky. The best a sutra or a talk about a sutra can do is to point directly at one's own mind. But this is like a finger pointing at the moon. And it's important not to mistake the finger for the moon or to be satisfied with descriptions of a thing you need to experience for yourself. So today I'm going to talk about the Lankavatara Sutra, which is probably one of my favorite sutras. I presented last year on the same topic, which Ryan Roshi shared to me was almost to the day 1 year ago. So some of you who attended last year may recognize some recycled content, but hopefully it will feel fresh to you here today. And I think we're going to learn a lot over the next year about what this series is about, but I don't have that benefit here today, so here goes nothing. So the outline of my talk is I'm going to talk about the history and background, including my personal story with the sutra. I'm going to talk about the story of Ravana from the first chapter, which I really like. I'm going to say something about what the Lankavatara tells us about the nature of mind. And we'll talk some about what the sutra tells us about realization and how we can apply this sutra to our own training. And I'll finish by saying something about how these principles apply to the Zen training we do in the Virtual Dojo. So the Lankavatara Sutra was written around 350 Common Era in India. So for reference, the Buddha was in the 5th century BC, first composed in Sanskrit and then translated in multiple times into Chinese and Tibetan, which says something about its importance. And the title means literally entering into Lanka. And it could be that it was a literal title because it was set in a place called Lanka, which is obvious from the text, which could relate to the island of Sri Lanka. And some have said that it could be related to the words could mean something like to reach or to go beyond, but it's a bit of a stretch, they say, that one. So the sutra has two main themes. So the first one is that the truth is to be realized in oneself. The Sanskrit term for that is prata Marayana Gochara. So it's kind of a mouthful, but it's the state of consciousness in which the inmost truth is directly presented in one's own mind. This is something that can't be adequately expressed in words. In Zen, we say you have to taste the tea for yourself, look inside or look under your feet. And we can also say that it's about being versus knowing. So it's not something that you can, we're not talking about something you can grasp through intellectual understanding. The other main theme is that all things are manifestations of the mind. So the Sanskrit term for that is Sita Matra, which means mind only, where the Sita, our mind, is the absolute reality. And this absolute mind is also in the sutra called the Dharma of Solitude, because this stands by itself. And then fundamental throughout is this thing we call the first principle. In this sutra, its manifestation is anatpada, which means unborn or not born of being and non-being. But it's another way of talking about emptiness. This sutra, in what's described, is rooted in what is called Yogacara, or mind-only Buddhism. This kind of branches off pretty early on in our lineage. That type of Buddhism, Yogacara, was founded by two brothers, Asanga and Vasubandhu. And you may recognize that name because Vasubandhu Sonja is the 21st Indian patriarch in the lineage we say in our Choka. But this was the quintessential Zen sutra for about at least 300 to 350 years by my math, before the Diamond Sutra. And Zen started, they say, with Bodhidharma, who came from India to China. And in all the stories, this sutra was what got handed by Bodhidharma to his successor, Huike. So he's the first Zen patriarch, and he says to his successor, this thing contains all you need to know, okay? And then it also comes up in the Platform Sutra, which you may know better, where there's the famous scene in the Platform Sutra in the beginning is this poetry battle between Sheng Shu and Hui Neng. And it's actually happening in the context, I don't know if you remember this part, but they're in this room and they're actually painting scenes from the Lankavatara on the walls. And the teacher says to, the monks, hey, anybody, is welcome to participate in this poetry contest and write something that describes your realization. And whoever wins this will be my, my lineage successor. And so Sheng Shu, who was kind of the shoo-in to be his successor, he was a Lankavatara guy, and he writes his poem out. And Hui Neng, who remember was this illiterate monk who heard the Diamond Sutra in the market and became instantly enlightened. He is working as a cook in the temple, and he sees what Sheng Shu writes, and he writes his own thing that's based on the Diamond Sutra. And it winds up that he wins the poetry battle, right? And we can say that basically the use of the sutra fell out of favor at that point, okay? Because the Hui Neng thought that the Diamond Sutra was it, and that's what gets used going forward. But historians also think that it related to the rise of large monasteries in China, because this sutra was incredibly long and difficult to understand and had many secret teachings that you needed the aid of a teacher to understand. And we went from having a situation where we had Bodhidharma, who had maybe a handful of successors, and the few guys after a few teachers after him also had a handful. And then we go to a situation where these large monasteries in China had hundreds and thousands of people, and they needed something that was more accessible, and the Diamond Sutra was it. So my own personal story with this sutra is that I became a priest in 2006. I think I pretty regularly went to priest training, which maybe happened 1 or 2 times per year in Hawaii. And I never read or covered this sutra in any of the priest trainings I attended. I don't know what's true for other priests. But when I went in 2017, on the occasion of the abbot Yokoyama Roshi retiring, I went there ostensibly to help him, I thought, pack boxes, and get ready to leave. But when I walked onto the grounds and encountered him, he asked me right off the bat about where I was at in my training. He asked me some questions. He saw an opening and he said, what we're going to do while you're here for 2 weeks is work on the Lankavatara Sutra. Here are the books. You're going to come in the kitchen every morning. And we did a kind of sanzen. And I later realized from how he was instructing me that the things he was instructing me in basically came out of the Lankavatara Sutra. He told me to basically be very quiet and tranquil, to isolate myself from other people. I wasn't to come and do zazen with the others that were coming in twice a day. He told me be in my room, don't talk to people, look out the window, look at things in nature. And I used the book sort of like a handbook. I compared my experience to what was written there, and I got quizzed, or I had my interview with him every day. And it was like, at first I was a few days behind in my understanding, maybe even more. And then, it was a day, and then it was a few hours, then it was 5 minutes. As I was walking at the door, I would realize something. And then I was right there. And that, a bunch of stuff also happened along the way. There were a lot of experiences which I refer to as my Kensho experience. So to me, I have a deep personal relationship to this sutra. I feel like it's described that Bodhidharma feels that everything you need is in here. I don't know that I'll be able to convey it to you, but I hope that some of the things hit with you as well. So there are a lot of different versions of this sutra or documents. So we have the Lankavatara Sutra translation by D.T. Suzuki, which you had as a PDF. There's also this extracts of the same text, which is in the Manual of Zen Buddhism, which I shared the link to if folks wanted to buy it. There's the handout on Ninth Consciousness, which I shared to the priest group through email. We have a manual on the Lankavatara Sutra, which is actually a collection of texts. The Studies of Lankavatara Sutra by D.T. Suzuki, which is actually, he doesn't bother kind of going in order of the text. He pulls out all of the key concepts and organizes it by theme, and I think that's really helpful. And then this short version by Goddard, who is actually a student of D.T. Suzuki, if you want to get kind of an overview of all the key chapters. And then this most recent version, a lot of people like the best. It was published in 2013. It's a translation by Red Pine. And it's really accessible because it's written kind of like in modern language by someone whose first language is English, and there's a lot of footnotes that explain all the many terms that are in it. So next I'm going to go through some vocabulary because there's a lot. So we'll start at the top right. We have the Sita Matra, which I've already talked about as a key theme. The mind only, mind being capital M mind, so not your small mind or your everyday mind. Can also call it absolute mind. And then going down the column on the right are things that basically mean the same thing. So there's a lot of discussion of this concept alaya vijnana, which is the all-conserving mind. It's the creative matrix from which everything comes. And this is kind of, the second row is kind of metaphysical in orientation. So, there's within the alaya vijnana, there's the jnana, which is the non-discriminating mind, absolute knowledge, and the vijnana, which is the discriminating mind, relative knowledge, the result of habit energy. So these things, alaya vijnana, yes, it means the same thing as Sita Matra, but it's sort of coming at it from a perspective where this thing includes the web of delusions that we create that leads to suffering. The third line, Tathagata Garbha, this is the embryo or womb of the Tathagata, where the Tathagata is the Buddha, okay? And that represents your, your emptiness, we also talk about it as to refer to suchness, or the true nature of reality that's beyond words, that, okay? And the conception here is like a religious one where the mind is seen as originally enlightened. And then another concept that comes up a lot is prajna at the bottom. So this is transcendental wisdom, mirror knowledge, intuition. We often call it kan, which is the Japanese word. And, it has this other word, dharasana jnana. So this is that which transcends jnana, vijnana. It's the intuitive mind is the linkage between these two parts. It goes beyond that. Okay, so next I'm going to go into the story of Ravana that's in the first chapter, which unfortunately isn't in the manual of Zen Buddhism copy. So this chapter is different from other chapters. Most scholars agree that it was added at a later point. And it's an allegory or story that encapsulates the lessons that are covered in other chapters, which I think makes it really useful. So it's the setting is that it's a big assembly on the Lanka island in the middle of the ocean, and it's on the top of Mount Malaya. The main characters are Ravana, who's the 10-headed ruler of Lanka, and he only appears in the first chapter. There's also Mahamati, which means great wisdom, who's the chief of the bodhisattvas. There's a lot of bodhisattvas and the Buddha, and then a bunch of lesser characters. Most of the sutra beyond this chapter is actually a conversation that happens between Mahamati and the Buddha. But the premise of this chapter is that Ravana has asked the Buddha to this occasion to lecture on the Lankavatara Sutra, which is noted many, many times, discloses the truth that's realized in one's inmost self. So there's tons of people at this event. It's described in very flowery terms. There's jewels on the mountains, there's flowers all over the chariots, there's music, there's singing, there's nice incense smells and good vibes. There's good, jeweled necklaces for the Buddha. And Ravana is getting more and more excited that he's going to get to ask his questions to the Buddha and receive this great wisdom. He's actually walking around the Buddha in a circle with a group of people and singing a song. And the song begins, "The truth treasure whose principle is the self-nature of mind has no selfhood, stands above all reasoning, and is free from impurities. It points to the knowledge attained in one's inmost self, Show me here the way leading to the truth. And the Buddha's sitting on top of the mountain. He's taking this all in. And it says he's looking at the waves of the ocean and also at the mental agitations going on in those assembled. And he thought of the ocean of the Alaya Vijnana, where the evolving Vijnanas, like the waves, are stirred by the wind of objectivity. So this is a really common metaphor that's used throughout. So the Alaya Vijnana is the all-conserving mind. It's like an ocean. And the Vijnana is the consciousness or discerning mind that are like waves on that ocean, okay? So he's seeing all this like mental activation, right, in his field. And so then the Buddha, it says the Buddha gives the complete sermon. And I note that none of the content of that sermon is shared, okay? That's not the point. The whole story is about what happens to Ravana, okay? So at that point, he gives his sermon, and then the Buddha and the sons of the Buddha immediately disappear, and they leave Ravana wondering, whoa, was that a dream that I just had? Was this something I made up? And I'm gonna read from the sutra for this part. So he says, how is this? What means this? And by whom was it heard? How is it that it was seen? And by whom was it seen? Where is the city and where is the Buddha? Where are those countries, those jewel shining Buddhas, those Sagatas? Is it a dream then, or a vision, or is it a castle conjured up by the Gandharvas? Or is it dust in the eye, or a fata morgana, or the dream child of a barren woman, or the smoke of a fire wheel, that which I saw here? Then Ravana reflected, this is the nature as it is of all things, which belongs to the realm of the mind. And it is not comprehended by the ignorant, as they are confused by every form of imagination. There is neither the seer nor the seen, neither the speaker nor the spoken. The form and usage of the Buddha and his Dharma, they are nothing but discrimination. Those who see things such as were seen before do not see the Buddha. Even when discrimination is not aroused, one does not see the Buddha. The Buddha, being fully enlightened, is seen where the world itself is not evolved. The Lord of Lanka was then immediately awakened from his reflection, feeling a revulsion in his mind and realizing that the world was nothing but his own mind. He was settled in the realm of non-discrimination. And then it talks about all these great things that happened to him. And it says, when he thoroughly understood the Tathagata Garbha, okay, that's the Buddha womb, the stage of Buddhahood, the inmost self, he found himself abiding in Buddha knowledge, when suddenly a voice was heard from the sky saying, it is to be known by oneself. So, who do you think said that? Well, was it the Buddha?
Was it his mind?
Okay, yeah, I think it might have been him. So sometimes stuff like that happens, right? It's happened to me where something comes out of nowhere and it doesn't, maybe it's a phrase, maybe it's an image, but it doesn't seem like it's coming from your regular mind because you don't recognize it as such. It's something beyond that. It's not something you could come up with using your everyday mind. So I think probably it was that. So the Buddha still hasn't appeared yet at this point, but Ravana again starts hearing a voice from the sky, and they say within himself, and it's outlining what he did that worked, seemingly for our benefit, okay? It's saying, yes, the yogin or practitioners should discipline oneself as you do. They need to look inwardly and not become attached to the letter and superficial view of things. They should destroy discourses advanced by others, keep themselves properly away from ego-centered notions, and cause a revulsion in the depths of the mind by means of an exquisite knowledge. So what do you think they mean by revulsion? In this, the DT Suzuki version, they use this word like crazy. Well, the definition of revulsion, it has a couple meanings. It could be a strong pulling away, sudden or strong reaction or change, or a sense of utter disgust. I kind of read it like the last one, like a spiritual revulsion that is in the deep recesses of our being. Another way to think about it is great doubt. For me, this kind of thing grew and grew and grew until something changed. So the two things, the change and the great doubt, were very much related to each other. Suzuki at different points also says you could say revolution here. So I don't know what the original word is. Revolution means turning around, but that somehow doesn't have the same charge, associated with it. So it's like he chose to use that word, and I think it's helpful. So our intuition tells us that things are not what they seem, that it's an illusion. And that's sort of what's, related to that doubt, okay? You need that thing to have the change, I think. The other thing they say that he did right was that you need to be purified, further purified in the way that you have attained by disciplining yourself well in samadhi and samapati. So samadhi is a term we use all the time to describe the state of relaxed concentration of no self. But samapati is a new one for us. It's often synonymous with samadhi, but it means perfect equilibrium, that you're tranquilized or in a state of tranquil composure, or that your waves become still. And this is kind of like one of the higher or highest form of samadhi. So it says later on, abide in the joy of samadhi and samapati and attain the ground where the Tathagatas walk. Okay, the Tathagatas are the Buddhas. So then the Buddha reappears on the mountain peak when Ravana is about to obtain, they say, the truth that existence has no origination. And the Buddha gives a big laugh, okay? It's like, taking up all the sound. And he has rays of light shooting out of every pore in his skin, and he's described as like a voluminous rainbow. And obviously very excited at what's occurred. And Ravana says, Blessed One, he finally gets to ask a question after this. He says, why does dualism exist that we're called upon to abandon? Which seems like a fair question, right? Like, why do we have to go through all this work? And the Buddha says, it's due to discrimination cherished by the ignorant. But noble wisdom is not to be realized by seeing things that way. And then he gives examples of things that are both continuous and individualized. So one example is of a fire that's burning down a building, where the fire is just one thing, as watching the building burn down, but it also has all these flames that when they are on different building materials, the size and the intensity of the flame is different. He also gives the example of one seed that produces both the branches and the stalk and the leaves and the petal. So those are examples of things that are both continuous and discriminated. He says differentiation of all these things isn't to be regarded as real, but come from one's clinging to appearances that the manifestations of his own mind are regarded as reality. And he also says even ideas of past, present, and future are discrimination. And he gives examples of things that have no real existence in themselves. And he says this is like what that experience is like. He says it's like seeing one's image in a mirror or in the water, or if you saw a shadow when you were walking around your house, or you heard your own voice echo in a valley. He says discrimination and non-discrimination must be transcended. If you go on discriminating, you won't attain tranquility. And by tranquility, it is meant oneness, and oneness gives birth to the highest samadhi, which is gained by entering into the womb of Tathagatahood, which is the realm of noble wisdom realized in one's inmost self. Okay, so that's Ravana's story, and it ends at that point. Okay, so next I'm going to go into what the Lankavatara Sutra tells us about the mind. So the experience described in the Lankavatara Sutra, like I said, is mind only, meaning nothing outside the capital M mind. And to support this, they include a lot of metaphysical or psychological concepts to describe how the mind works. I'm going to show a slide here. So this is a diagram I developed from the 9th consciousness handout that I gave you. What it shows is we have our 5 sense consciousnesses at the top. So sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. And then Buddhists also include, they say there's 6 senses. So you have 5 senses, they say there's 6. And that is your intellect. So that's the 6th consciousness. You can also think of this as like a sense center that organizes the information from your senses and all your reactions. And then there's a 7th consciousness called manas, which you can think of like the self or self-ego. They also talk about it like a particularizing or willing agency. So it makes things sort of come out of nothing. And then there's the 8th consciousness, which we've already introduced, which is the alaya vijnana. It's often called the storehouse unconsciousness. And I put a little ocean there because that's often how it's described. So it's basically this site of potential. It's got everything in it, like all the seeds of different things that could happen. Karma's in there, everything is in this alaya vijnana. And in the Lankavatara, as it's the copy we have, this is more or less, the first 8 is more or less how it's conceptualized. But later on in Buddhism, they add on the 9th consciousness. And this one is talked about in the Lankavatara too, but it's sort of talked about in a different way, not within the framework of the 8 consciousnesses. So this is the transcendent unconscious, the true self, original nature, mirror wisdom, prajna, or Khan. And this is more like the realization aspect of the alaya vijnana. And often kind of the metaphors used here are one of a mirror or a flash of lightning. You can also, let's say, you can think of this pyramid where intuitive realization is at the bottom, Thinking, desiring, discriminating is in the middle, and then the senses and their reactions are at the top. And this framework also maps to the body, the physical body. And I'm going to read a passage from D.T. Suzuki, which is on the Ninth Consciousness handout that goes into this. So he says, to continue this symbolic talk, the head is conscious while the abdomen is unconscious. When the master tells his disciples to think with the lower part of the body, he means that the koan is to be taken down to the unconscious and not to the conscious field of consciousnesses. The koan is to sink into the whole being and not stop at the periphery. Literally, this makes no sense, which goes without saying. But when we realize that the bottom of the unconscious where the koan sinks is where even the alaya vijnana, the all-conserving consciousness cannot hold it, we see that the koan is no more in the field of intellection. It is thoroughly identified with oneself. The koan is now beyond all limits of psychology. When all these things are transcended, which means going even beyond the so-called collective unconscious, one comes upon what is known in Buddhism as adarasana jnana, mirror knowledge. The darkness of the unconscious is broken through, and one sees all things as one sees one's face in the brightly shining mirror. The other thing that's important about what they're saying in the Lankavatara Sutra concerning this framework is that the way of seeing is our way of normally how we conceptualize thinking is backwards. So we think that the stimuli come in through the senses and go down, but the way it's conceived in this sutra is that it starts at the bottom and goes through the top. So how the mind works according to science, most of us are well aware, but the information comes from outside. This is read in through like sensory data that is processed by the brain. So you have like light waves coming off this tree that get read as green, and then the eye processes and sends the information to the brain and says it's a tree. But what the Lankavatara Sutra is saying is, no, that's backwards. What happens is those things are dependent on the self, okay? It starts with you saying, I am a thing, and then saying, those are things too, okay? There's a green tree, there's a red apple, okay? Maybe that apple's part of your lunch, so you say, that's my apple, okay? And then but if this person who's sitting here was blind, maybe those things wouldn't be part of her universe. Or maybe if she had red-green color blindness, they would look like brown things. You know, her experience of them would be different. And then additionally, there's a bunch of stuff going on in her head, right? Like maybe she's thinking about her grandma who's sick or passed away, and she starts to get some emotional reaction to it. So even though it's in her mind, it actually becomes a real part of her actual experience in the here and now. And then if she hears some vibrations from outside, she thinks is outside, you know, if she's in the here and now, it's one note, but somehow she's conscious of both the one note and the note that came before that, and she processes that into a melody, and she says, that's music, okay? So there's a lot of things that are actually dependent upon her for their existence. She's the one who's giving them existence. It's not the tree saying, hey, look at me, I'm a tree, I'm green, right? That thing is coming from her. And she's also making herself, right? So that's fundamental to the thing. So we talked about in the vocabulary slide that there's two things. There's the non-discriminating mind, the jnana, and then what we're talking about now is all the discriminating mind, right? Like the vijnana. And I wanted to go into the two types of intellect that you have that are associated with that vijnana, your discriminating mind, because I think that it's useful. So you have an intellect that discriminates and identifies, and this is dependent on outside knowledge or memory. And if you want more vocabulary words, it's called paratantra. You also have a form of intellect that generalizes. It connects and weaves disconnected parts together into an imaginative world. It also perceives relationships and value. So this is called parikalpita. And examples of this, because I think it's harder to grasp than the first one, is when you look out the window, the fact that you see a landscape rather than a billion leaves, branches, and blades of grass. Another example is if I said to you 1 + 1 = 2, the type of intellect that I'm talking about for the second one would be the plus and the equal sign. So these two types of intellect work together to construct your experience. And they give your experience a sense of permanence or solidity or flow. And they create these categories of me and mine and not me and mine, which obscures the underlying truth. So what color is this?
Yellow.
Yellow. Okay. Sorry, go ahead. I saw one in the chat. Go ahead. I was going to say, is there anyone who has any doubt that this is yellow? Does anyone think that this is red and blue, or red or blue or white or any other color? Kelly says it's lime. Did anyone have any doubt, or could I convince you it's red? Okay. Did it take any effort for you to come to that conclusion about what color it was, or did it happen to you in an instant that you knew? It's pretty fast. Yeah, instantly, right? And how do you know yellow? Were you pre-programmed with yellow? Did you come that way out of the box? Or did your parents and your caretakers maybe spend years drilling that one into you, the concept of yellow, so that you'd have that ability, right? So this is an example of the mind that discriminates and identifies. So what was that?
Dog barking.
Yeah. Where are the dogs? You said it was dogs barking. How did you know it was dogs? Where's the sound coming from?
From the speaker.
Okay. Was there a dog originally that made the sound? I mean, we assume so, right? But we don't know much about it. Like the dog could be alive, or there's probably two, as Ellen said, at least. But did the dogs come into being when I clicked this slide, and did they go away when I clicked again? Or were they always there to begin with? And then as Gina said, it was coming out of her speaker. But who's creating the sound based on puffs of air coming out of the speaker? Is it the dog? Is it the computer? Who's creating the sound?
The computer operator who touched the button.
So I'm creating the sound.
Yes.
Okay. Well, this one is more interesting because your mind is kind of doing like a shortcut, right? Like there's a lot's happening. Like I hit a button that triggered some data getting processed that's stored as ones and zeros in somebody's computer on a microchip, and somehow going through Google, I know somehow because I found the sound through Google, and I'm using Google Slides. Everything's related to Google these days. And then, through the wonders of the internet, maybe depending on where you live, it's traveling underwater, under the ocean, by internet to your computer. And then somehow you're telling me it's a dog, right? But it's pretty disconnected from the dog. So there's a lot of like shortcutting there to get to the idea that this is a dog, but you did it instantly, I'd say without any effort at all. And this is an example of the mind that connects things and weaves them together. So there's a famous Zen master, Bankei, who used to use these kinds of exercises as proofs to his students of their unborn minds. So he said, we see and hear all things no matter what they are, although you haven't generated a single thought to see or hear them, because of the vital working of the unborn mind. So you didn't try to do something, it just happened, right? You created yellow, you created that dog sound. And I want to see if I can give you an example of how you create space and time as well. So the exercise I want you to do is kind of like this guy, where I want you to take a moment, open up your vision, and see whatever things are in front of you right now. Like, what does your here and now experience look like? Take note of it. And take, let's say, 2 or 3 deep breaths there. And then I want you to put your head a little bit, like maybe like 2 inches to the side. And then I'm going to get your notes on, what happened and what your reactions were. So please go ahead. Raise your hand if you had the experience of being like, whoa, what the hell was that? My whole universe changed. Did anyone have that experience? Okay. And this is a visual, I reconstructed a visual about like what happens, right? So things shift perceptibly, but kind of in a small way. And you recognize that as, like to be expected, right? No big deal. But it is kind of a big deal because what you have is a bunch of snapshots, okay? And you've constructed almost like this 3D model in your head about what your house looks like based on a lot of these really detailed images. And you are, in an instant, basically comparing what you see to this this conception and saying, yeah, that checks out, right? But you're weaving the whole thing together, and that's how you're creating space. So like, do you remember in the movie, a lot of people have seen the movie The Matrix, when there's all this code that's basically programming their 3D reality. And they could tell when the bad guys were messing with things because somehow they'd be looking around and then like a cat would just appear out of nowhere, right? Like that would be pretty freaky if when you moved your head to the side, like some lion appeared or something like that happened, right? But that's not what happened. But this experience of what I just told you to do, you know, turning your head to this side, I did this looking out the window, and that's when I realized, oh, I create space and time. It's that simple, okay? Here's another example of a flip book. This is like how you create time. So you have a bunch of pictures, which you could think of as here and now, and you're stringing them together in a way to create Michael Jackson dancing, right? And you can recognize him because you know how he dances and you know what kind of clothes he used to wear, right? But it's like this that we create time too, okay? Out of a bunch of here and nows. So it's from this kind of perspective that we can say that the world is created fresh and new in every moment, okay? And what's underlying this? Shunyata, or emptiness. The Heart Sutra says form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And we can recognize that shunyata is not just emptiness, but is also the constantly changing relationship between things. Prajna is also that. So shunyata is prajna, and prajna is shunyata. And they say that when prajna intuition takes place, it annihilates space-time relationships. All existence is reduced to a single point in time-space. No time divisible into past, present, and future. So the reason it wasn't weird for you when you changed your head like this is because you weren't in that state of mind, right? You said, seems about right, because you were comparing it to something else, right? So what is illusion? The illusion of ordinary experience is that the visible world has self-nature or exists in itself. This means what we can see, the visible world, is a partial truth that gets mistaken for the real thing. We think that it has self-nature or exists by itself. We can also say that without discrimination, no world is possible. Suzuki said, discrimination is born of habit energy or memory, which lies latently preserved in the alaya vijnana or all-conserving consciousness. This consciousness has no power to act by itself. It is altogether passive and remains inactive until a particularizing agency touches it. And he says this thing is mysterious. Okay, it just is. So the Buddha also said to Mahamati that there are 4 reasons why the I consciousness arises, and they're kind of interesting. Think about why. So what are they? Number 1, clinging to an external world, not knowing that it is the mind itself. Attaching to form and habit energy accumulated since beginningless time by false reasoning and erroneous views. 3, the self-nature inherent in the vijnana. This one's a little bit confusing. Like, what does that mean? But in plain language, it means you made it a thing when it wasn't a thing. 4, eagerness for multiple forms and appearances. By these 4 reasons, Mahamati, the waves of the evolving vijnanas are stirred on alaya vijnana, which resembles the waters of a flood. The same can be said of the other sense consciousnesses as of the I consciousness. This consciousness arises at once or by degrees in every sense organ, including in its atoms and pores of the skin. The sense field is apprehended like a mirror, reflecting objects like the ocean swept over by the mind. Go on to talk about attachments to discriminations being very deep-seated. I like this passage. It says, the ignorant and simple-minded go on ever discriminating like silkworms, which with their own thread of discrimination and attachment enwrap not only themselves but others and are charmed with the thread. And thus they are ever tenaciously attached to the notions of existence and non-existence. The imagining of things not existent, this is characteristic of attachment deeply seated in all beings. When the truth of this is thoroughly understood, the net of attachment is cleared away. The ignorant take hold of the knowledge of existence according to words and are bound up like the silkworm with their own discriminations, hence their ignorance of attachment deeply seated in their minds. Bankei said, being ignorant of the fact that you have a Buddha mind, you live in illusion. Why is it that you're deluded? Because you're partial to yourself. So we're all self-centered and distracted by our own beautiful silk thread in the cocoon that we're weaving. D.T. Suzuki said, ordinarily, all our cognitive apparatus is made to work outwardly in a world of relativity. And for this reason, we become deeply involved in it, so that we fail to realize the freedom we all intrinsically possess. And as a result, we are annoyed on all sides. To turn away from all this, what may psychologically be called a revulsion or revolution that must take place in our inmost consciousness. This is not, however, a mere empirical psychological fact to be explained in terms of consciousness. It takes place in the deepest recesses of our being. So going next into what this sutra tells us about realization. So what's on the other side of this revulsion? It says, we have an intuition into the self-nature of all things by the wisdom which is acquired within oneself. You could say this is ultimate reality, emptiness. But again, we're going to go back to things we raised in the beginning. One of the ways they describe it is being unborn. So they describe unborn as all things being devoid of doing, and doer are unborn. As there is no doer, all things are therefore said to be unborn. All things are unborn. Why? Because they have no reality, being manifestations of the mind itself. And as they are not born of being and non-being, they are unborn. The other conception we talked about was Tathagata-garbha, right? The Buddha womb. And so they say about that, what is perfect knowledge? It is realized when one casts aside the discriminating notions of form, name, reality, and character. It is the inner realization by noble wisdom. This is perfect knowledge, Mahamati, and this is the essence of the Tathagata-garbha. I'm going to read a passage that's interesting. That's Mahamati asking a question about this Tathagata-garbha. So he says, Mahamati says, now the Blessed One makes mention of the Tathagata-garbha in the sutras, and verily it is described by you as by nature bright and pure, as primarily unspotted, endowed with the 32 marks of excellence, hidden in the body of every being like a gem of great value, which is enwrapped in a dirty garment, enveloped in the garment of the skandhas, dhatus, and ayatanas, and soiled with the dirt of greed, anger, folly, and false imagination, while it is described by the Blessed One to be eternal, permanent, auspicious, and unchangeable. Is not this Tathagata-garbha taught by the Blessed One the same as the ego substance taught by the philosophers. The ego, as taught in the systems of the philosophers, is an eternal creator, unqualified, omnipresent, and imperishable. The Blessed One says, no, Mahamati, my Tathagata Garbha is not the same as the ego taught by the philosophers. For what the Tathagatas teach is that the Tathagata Garbha, in this sense, Mahamati, that is, it is emptiness, reality limit, nirvana, being unborn, unqualified, and devoid of will effort. The reason why the Tathagatas, who are arhats and fully enlightened ones, teach the doctrine pointing to the Tathagata Garbha is to make the ignorant cast aside their fear when they listen to the teaching of egolessness, and to have them realize the state of non-discrimination and imagelessness. I also wish, Mahamati, that the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas of present and future would not attach themselves to the idea of an ego, imagining it to be a soul. So he makes it clear that the small mind that creates is not what he's talking about. And then he says a funny thing, right? Which is like, kind of like, we made it all up, right? We did this to teach people something, but it's not the thing itself, right? It's just a concept that conveys something to a particular group of people. The other way we talk about this thing is we call it the first principle, or the one vehicle, which is sort of like, it's not really trying to describe anymore what it is, more in terms of its importance, or the fact that, yeah, the one vehicle aspect, when you say it that way, it emphasizes the pathway to get there. So there's something I'll read about that. So Mahamati again is asking a question to the Buddha. He says, pray tell me, Blessed One, about the one vehicle that characterizes the inner realization of noble wisdom, whereby, Blessed One, I and other bodhisattva mahasattvas becoming conversant with the one vehicle, which marks the inner attainment of noble wisdom, may be established without depending on anybody else in the teaching of the Buddha. Then the Buddha said, in accordance with the authoritative teachings in which there are no discriminations, Mahamati, let the Bodhisattva Mahasattva retire by himself to a quiet, secluded place where he may reflect within himself, not relying on anybody else, what it means by his own inner intelligence, in order to discard erroneous views of discrimination, make successive advances, and exert himself to finally enter upon the stage of Tathagatahood. This, Mahamati, is the characteristic feature of the inner realization to be gained by means of noble wisdom. What characterizes the way of the one vehicle? I call it the one vehicle because thereby one recognizes and realizes the path leading to the one vehicle. How is the path of the one vehicle to be recognized and realized? The recognition of the one vehicle is obtained when there is no rising of discrimination by doing away with the notion of grasp and grasping, and by abiding in the reality of suchness. Mahamati, this recognition of the one vehicle, except by the Tathagata himself, has never been obtained before by anybody else. For that reason, Mahamati, it is known as the one vehicle. So that's kind of strange, right? That he's saying nobody has ever attained this ever before. So what does that mean? So how can we apply this sutra to our own training? We can talk about it, which we're doing right now, or we can realize it for ourselves. And that's an extensive part of what's in the teaching. And like I said, it's about being versus knowing. So understanding this from a philosophical perspective is not enough. You have to find it out in your own experience. So the Lankavatara Sutra, it has this list of things a bodhisattva has to do in his spiritual discipline. It says he has to have 4 things. The bodhisattva must have penetrating comprehension in regards to the nature of the manifestation of mind, be free from such notions as birth, abiding, and destruction, observe that external objects do not exist, and earnestly desire a state of realization by directly seeing into the inmost self. So the first seems to refer to the fact that maybe this stuff is helpful. Maybe you don't need to understand the Lankavatara Sutra to actually get there. Most people probably don't or haven't even read it, and they've managed to get there. But some comprehension, or in a penetrating way, in some maybe conceptual framework of how the mind works. Okay, and it's not just from a conceptual place, though that probably helps along the way. But this is sort of my list of what the Lankavatara Sutra says are key ingredients for self-realization. And a lot of it comes from the first chapter. But it is repeated throughout. So you need to look inward and have confidence that the great wisdom or realization resides within oneself. In Zen, we call this great faith. So in the beginning, when I started, I thought that great faith was having faith in my teachers and in the technology that I was learning. But I realized later on, as I got to the place where I was starting to realize these things, that it also meant having confidence that it was inside me, not outside. I didn't, stop looking outside, go inward. That's the direction you need to go. The other thing is the deep spiritual revulsion that we talked about, or revolution, the turning about, the paraviti. And like I said, I think this is similar to what we call the great doubt. That's a necessary ingredient. This thing is the catalyst. We sometimes talk about it like, say, swallowing the iron ball. And it's just like the word revulsion, right? There's something uncomfortable about it. And it's important to not turn away from that thing, because that's the thing that's going to help you get there. We also talk about taking up your koan and your hara, as helping you generate this kind of feeling or great doubt. You also need to discipline yourself, meaning have great will, in samadhi and samapati. This helps lead to the highest samadhi, the samadhi of oneness, where the noble wisdom is realized in oneself. So going back to the tranquilization, you need the waves to become still. You need to sit quietly alone, undisturbed. It's not going to happen if you are getting constant notifications on your mobile phone, or your roommates or your spouse is bothering you. You need to be undisturbed so your waves can become still. And then samadhi. We know what this is, but you need to trust it, okay? Don't rely on the habits of the discriminating mind. Don't go back to that because you don't trust that samadhi is a way that you can exist in the world. And then also going back and forth with the teacher through sanzen to deepen the realization. This comes out. So lastly, I'm going to talk about how these principles apply to Zen training in the virtual dojo. So I think many of us here have done intensive training in the virtual dojo, and had the experience of feeling a little bit like Ravana when you close your laptop after Keishin or Zazen Kai, and you're thinking, whoa, what happened? Was that something I made up? Was that a dream? And I've said before that the felt experience I have of sitting online is that I create the dojo and the community, and they create me fresh moment by moment. So I leave a different person, different than when I came in. And that feels a bit like magic because nothing much has changed in my immediate environment when I close my computer, and then everything disappears. The sutra says the truth is to be realized within oneself. And from this perspective, the reason why a virtual space can help, can work to train students in Zen is that the human body is the true Zen dojo. It's the minimal necessary unit is the student themselves. And this is something I actually realized while training in the virtual dojo. The rest of the forms that we have for our dojo, the training structure, they no doubt help us, but they appear through the touch of a button brought to you by your capital M mind and the wonders of the internet, in the form of a jikijitsu, a schedule, a connection to leaders and other community members who are training and on the path with you. And all of this feels kind of magical. And somehow interfacing with this community through a computer makes, to me, the workings of the mind that much more obvious. So just as you create yourself, you're also creating a dojo without trying. But you need to thoroughly investigate the I that is creating these things. It's not the I that feels an ego trip when I tell you you made those things, right? It's that's the small self that's having that reaction. So in Zen, we stress personal experience as being the only thing of critical importance. And so please don't just take my word for it. I want you to experience these things for yourself. And with that, I'll take questions. Handarashi?
Roshi.
This is not a question, but just a comment. Very recently, the Nobel Prize was awarded to 3 physicists. And I don't understand in depth the experiment or what they did, but basically what they said was that the external world that we believe exists, they said they have proof that it does not. And for me, that's a big deal. I just wanted to mention that. This dualism is so ingrained in us that it's like, it's common. If you talk to 100 people and you ask them, is the external world real? I think 99% of them would say, yes, it's real. And according to the Lankavatara Sutra, and actually Mahayana thinking, it is not, because we create it in our minds and it is mind only. That's pretty hard to swallow. Unless you have had some kind of a thing physically happen to you where you know for sure that that is true. Okay, but this physics thing, it to me is important because it's like everybody is, the idea that science is studying the world Everybody knows that. But now the physicists, these 3 Nobel winners have come up and said, this world that science is studying does not exist apart from us. It is not out there. And I don't know, I was like, whoa, well, that's what the Buddhists have been saying for a long time. I just thought I'd just throw that out.
Thanks for sharing. And Christy shared the link. I want to read about it now.
No, it's all over the internet. If you just,
Yeah.
I mean, it was all over the internet. The 3 guys who won the Nobel Prize, yeah, for physics just a few days ago. Yeah, they're talking
Yeah.
about the spooky action. It's complicated, but the basic idea is that this world that we believe will be that is out there, and if we die, we still believe the world will be out there. That is not the case. If we're not here, the world is not here. And
Thanks for
science,
sharing.
yeah, the scientists have just said, yeah, that's the way it is.
Thanks for sharing. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think your observation is a good one. And it's important. We always have to observe things from the perspective of our personal experience. And I think you're right that we think there's an objective reality, like time is this way, space is this way. But most of us have that exact observation that you said, that time and space contract depending on our state of mind, right? Most people know that, but somehow just kind of, I don't know, there's sort of like, I don't know what they call it, cognitive dissociation or something. They just sort of overlook that, right? And it certainly seems true with the way social media is now, where you only read things online based on what confirms beliefs you had already, that everybody's existing in all different worlds, right? You talk to certain family members and they tell you all these different conspiracies and weird things that are happening in the world that you know are not really true, so it really, there are a lot of different ways that it's true that we live in a universe of our own creation. And those ones are maybe most obvious, I think, to see. Yeah, so thanks for sharing. Any other comments? I would say like you're in the one true dimension that exists, and when you're in your normal mind, you're in the other dimension. Why don't we say it that way? Right? If you're grounded in the here and the now and approaching samadhi, the definition is from the perspective of no self, right? So that's reality. And when you create a bunch of different universes, depending on how you feel that day, or how your emotions change from moment to moment, those are the different dimensions or universes you're creating. Those are the multitude of things that you're creating. Being in samadhi is coming back to yourself, right? Remembering who you are.
For me, what's very important is to be as aware as possible of what's going on within myself. Because to me, that is the key to being able to get to this Dharma of solitude. Because when I see what's going on within myself. I see the discrimination. I see all of this kind of stuff going on. It's like, oh my God. Okay, so you just you deal with it. And it's like, for me, it's like doing Zazen all the time. But the important thing is to be aware of what's going on inside, because if we're not aware of it, total definition of ignorance. So we're trying to cut this ignorance as much as possible. I'm still working on it very hard. And I can't say I'm very good at it now, so it's just something I keep doing.
There's one of those cell phones bringing you out of the Dharma of solitude. Yeah, no, this is a great point. I feel strongly about that as well. You need to get really grounded in your subjective experience, the personal experience. Stop worrying about what's going on outside, because those things you're worrying about outside is creating waves on your ocean. So focus inward on what's going on inside you. That's where the answer is. Krishna Roshi?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for this really good explanations. Very good session. But I want to put a very cheap plug into. We have both Seishing and Keishing coming up. And that is the time to really get into the place of deep samadhi and solitude. So everyone sign up. And when you go, keep all these teachings in mind and then out of mind. So thank you.
Thanks, Krishna Roshi. Good point. And that sounds like a good way to end. So thank you so much for coming, and appreciate all that you brought Ki-wise and your questions and your great doubt. And thank you so much.